The central question of my piece, Anger, Exposure to Violence, and Intragroup Conflict, is about how do emotions influence communities affected by violence. So there's a large question in literature looking at, well, how do communities cope with violence? And I looked at the effect of exposure to rocket fire in two communities in southern Israel, Ofakim and Sderot. The latter, Sderot, is nestled right against the Gaza Strip and had been exposed to rocket fire continuously since the early 2000s, whereas Ofakim had only more recently come into fire at the time that I conducted my research, which was in the summer of 2010. So my main question was, how do emotions help or hinder these communities from cohering? And so several people had argued that people get angry about the violence that affects them, and it kind of tears the community apart. But there had been more recent research in political science and economics that actually showed that exposure to violence increased how cohesive a community was. So what I did is I utilized the fact that both Sderot and Ofakim, up until they had been exposed to rocket fire, were largely similar. They had similar waves of immigration. They were both vast majority Jewish. And the only difference was that Sderot had been exposed to a high amount of rocket fire, and Ofakim had been exposed to much less rocket fire. So I used them as kind of a natural experiment to what happens when communities are exposed to violence. And so I performed, I went to Sderot and Ofakim in the summer of 2010, and what myself and my research assistants did is we basically invited people to community centers to participate in an experiment. And during the experiment, we primed people for anger over the rocket fire or a more neutral manipulation. And then we had people play games with money. And what we wanted to see was, does priming people for anger over the rocket fire, does that lead them to be nicer to members of their community, in this case, people that were in the experiment with them at the community center, or does it lead them to be less nice and in fact be more sort of, you could say, anti-cohesive, anti-community spirit? And we had people play games with money because there's a lot of research that suggests that when people make decisions with money, they're more likely to be sort of truthful. It's like, put your money where your mouth is. And so what we found was that people in the high exposure city, Sderot, were actually, anger made them more likely to be, it actually decreased how much money they took away from people in their community, whereas in Ofakim, it actually increased increased how much money they took away from their members of their community. So basically, in a nutshell, is that we think that exposure to violence can actually lead to some cohesive effects in these communities. So Sderot, people were generally more altruistic than in Ofakim, less likely to punish members of their community. And what I suggest is that anger is an emotion, so anger about the violence that they're experiencing doesn't necessarily lead people to turn on their own community members, but in fact can lead them to be even more cohesive and sort of come together. And this result is borne out in more recent studies as well that shows that exposure to violence increases people's participation in politics, voting, etc. But it also kind of can have a dark side. So other people have found that exposure to violence increases political participation, but it can also increase in-group favoritism, discrimination, etc. So while we think it's a good thing normatively that people exposed to violence can actually cohere with their own community, there also are sometimes these unintended long-run effects where, besides the fact that people are exposed to violence, that it actually can change their political views, and that they're nicer members of their own in-group, but they maybe are perhaps more wary of out-group members.